We're asking a big question today. Should you bribe your children? Is it okay to bribe your children? Is it necessary to? Sometimes you don't have a choice. So it feels, at least. We have to be careful to say that there's no choice, because ultimately there's always a choice. Sometimes it feels like there's no choice. What else are we supposed to do? So I'm not going to ask you your opinion about whether you should bribe your children or not. But I am going to ask you this. What is the difference between a bribe and an incentive? Because if I word it differently and I say, is it okay to incentivize your children? Everybody's going to say, of course. Nothing wrong with that. You should incentivize your child. So then what's the difference between an incentive and a bribe? A bribe. Okay, it's a good observation. That is. That's a very good observation. That there is a sense of impulsivity around a bribe, which is not necessarily around an incentive. So an incentive is typically something that you plan, and you know in advance where you're going. And a bribe feels like when you're in a desperate situation. That's when you're going to use a bribe. In fact, I'll tell you, I saw an interesting. I don't know if this is like absolute, but I saw an interesting suggestion that the difference between an incentive and a bribe is this. Your child is lying on the floor having a tantrum, and now you offer them, get up and I'll give you something. That's a bribe. And an incentive is when you say to your child, if you learn for your exams, or if you do your household chores, or whatever the case is, then you'll get some kind of a reward, some kind of. So that's an incentive, right? That's one of the suggestions about the difference between a bribe and an incentive. But I came across two very interesting studies, very, very interesting. One was done in 1973, and one was done in 2011. So quite different. So the what they did the study that was done in 1973 was they looked at children in preschool age, and they found the kids who really enjoyed drawing. They took out of this group, I don't know how many children were involved, but they took a whole lot of kids that enjoyed drawing, and then they got them to draw for a period of time. Then they split them into two groups. The one group, they just told them just to continue drawing, like as you normally would. The other group, they said to them, if you draw, at the end you'll get a certificate for your artwork. So they did this for a period of time, and this group was drawing, and that group was drawing, and that was fine. At the end of this program, so the kids who got the certificates got their certificates, and then they went to observe what these kids would do when they went back into their normal classroom routine. And what they discovered was that the kids who had been drawing all along without the certificate, without the incentive, because that's an incentive, it's not a bribe, it's an incentive, because this is planned in advance, it's not impulsive. So those kids who had been drawing without the incentive, when they went back to their classroom setting, they just carried on drawing. The kids who had now gotten used to the idea that there's a certificate, when they went back to the class, they weren't drawing anymore. So the teachers asked them, why are you not drawing anymore? And they said, well, because now there's no longer a certificate. So what they worked out from this study, which is really interesting, is they worked out that if a child is already inclined to doing something, if they're already good at something, if they already enjoy doing something, whatever the case is, now you attach an incentive to something that they're already doing, you actually now shift it completely. Because what was happening originally is they were doing this particular thing because they enjoyed it, or because it was part of their skill set. And that's why they were doing it. So why was the child drawing? Because they enjoyed drawing. Now you've changed the definition of why they draw. So this is no longer something that I do because I want to do it. Now what's happened is you've turned it into something that you do because there's a benefit, because there's some kind of price tag associated with it. So if you do X, then you'll get this reward. So now it becomes transactional, which basically says, I don't know if I need this right now, so I won't get the certificate. That's fine, but then I won't have to draw. So two things happen. The first is you start making this cost-benefit calculation in your head. Is it worth the cost of having to sit and draw? Is it worth it to get the incentive that I've been offered? Which is always the danger of an incentive. You tell your child, if you clean your room, you're going to get X. Child could say, maybe I don't want X, so I just won't clean my room. If you tell the child that if you put your dishes away, then you'll be able to get dessert, Maybe they don't care for the dessert, so they don't put their dishes away. Or maybe at that particular point in time, it's more valuable for them to go and run on and play their PlayStation than it is to put the dishes away and get the dessert. So essentially what they worked out is that if a child has something which is intrinsically part of their personality, their skill set, the things that they enjoy, their recreation, I'm going to add one other layer to this, all their responsibilities, and now you add an incentive, you've skewed their view of what that particular thing is, and now it's become about the reward rather than about the behavior or the responsibility or whatever the case is. So that was a very, very interesting study. And that essentially illustrates that you run the risk with an incentive. I'm not talking yet about a bribe, but you run the risk with an incentive, which is much healthier than a bribe. You run the risk of bringing the child to a point where they no longer do what they're good at or what they should be doing. Very interesting. Now, if we define that a bribe is almost a desperation, ultimately, because that's why the example of that kid who's having their tantrum in the middle of the shop, and now you say to them, come, get up off the floor, we'll get you a chocolate or whatever the case is. So if we understand that even an incentive could have a negative outcome for the child, then certainly a bribe is going to have a negative outcome for the child, because effectively what you're saying is that this behavior can only be resolved with some kind of an external offer. And that's a really bad position to put ourselves as parents, because then we land up in a very weak position. Now the child actually holds the key, because the child's going to say, I'm going to continue having the tantrum until I get the kind of bribe that I want, which is obviously a very weak position for the parent. So we can clearly distinguish that to bribe a child is never a good idea. But really the real question is, to incentivize a child, is it always a good idea? So far we have one study, and it's a study that's been around for long. It's a 50-year-old study, more, that effectively illustrates that putting an incentive in place with something that a child should or could be doing of their own accord is actually detrimental. So then, is there any value in an incentive program? Because if you think about it, we all grew up with some kind of incentives, whether it was at school or whether it was at home. And we all expect to have certain incentives in our experience of either how we parent or in school, how they teach. So, do you have merit badges at school? Of course you do, right? I'm not talking about sports awards where you actually achieve something, or academic awards. I'm talking about merit badges. I'm talking about where a class, for example, is told by the teacher that if you do da-da-da-da-da, you will get whatever it is, an end of your party, a free period, an outing, or whatever the case is. It's kind of baked into the system. This idea of incentivizing is baked into the system. So the question is that a bad thing? Because are we now, for example, taking away a child's ability, independence? And that's the big debate. The big debate around incentives is to find the balance between allowing the child a sense of their own agency versus getting a child to do things that they should. So sometimes you feel like you need the incentive to get them to do what they should, but then you wonder, have I now stolen their ability to have agency? You looked like you wanted to say something.
No, it's exactly what happens in the classroom.
Incentives,
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, it's go up the ladder,
Key.
fill in the bucket.
Exactly.
There's
And at
this
each,
toy and this
but at home, star charts.
Star charts, exactly.
It's right across the board, right? It's so endemic in the way that we raise children. But if you start to think about it, it actually raises many questions. Let's look at it this way. What incentive were you given to stop at the red light?
Threat of life and danger.
So it's not an incentive. It's not an incentive.
It's a life.
Could you imagine if you expected the government to come up with a program where they put cameras at every intersection, and then all the people who stop at the red light get a point system? And then when you get enough points, you're allowed to skip a red light, or you're allowed to speed, or something like that. Could you imagine having such a thing? It would be a little bit ridiculous, right? Be a little ridiculous. One incentive, I mean, maybe for children we do have incentives to brush their teeth. But as an adult, what incentive are you given to brush your teeth? You're not. There is the threat of what happens if you don't. But we don't live with incentives. And obviously, you get to a certain point where life is no longer about incentives. Life is just about understanding the intrinsic value of things. So the question is, where does that crossover point happen? And another layer to this question is, What is a healthy incentive? And this is where we're on the cusp of bribe versus incentive. Not every incentive has to be a thing. Because what we completely underestimate is the value of a verbal incentive, which means when we give verbal feedback to a child, which says, look what you did, that was great, you took responsibility, I'm very proud of you, any language like that, that in itself might be enough. In other words, we jump often to the incentive of a thing. So if you do da-da-da-da, you will get a thing. Now, there's nothing wrong with a child learning that over time you can earn things. Nothing wrong with that. It's far better than just giving them everything for nothing. We just lay it on for our kids. That's not a bad thing at all, to learn the value of earning things. Simultaneously, I think what happens is we rush to the incentive, and this is where it's on the cusp of a bribe, of giving something to the child, not realizing that a child is incentivized by being seen, by being recognized, by being praised. So that's also interesting, which brings us to the experiment that was done in 2011. Different experiment. I'll call this, I don't know if this was the particular thing, but we'll call it the Brussels sprouts experiment, because as we well know, there's certain foods that are classic, they're the stereotypical foods that children don't eat. So we'll call it the Brussels sprouts incentive, right? Or experiment. So what do you do to get a child to eat a food that they don't like? Because it's healthy for them. So, the vegetable. That big, ogre of a vegetable. How do you get the child to eat that vegetable? So it was an interesting experiment, because what they did was they experimented first with a group of children where they took this particular kind of food that these kids weren't eating. Doesn't specify exactly what it was, so we're just going to assume that it was Brussels sprouts, right? So they got these kids under threat, basically, to say, if you don't eat them, whatever, what's going to happen? And the kids all started to eat these vegetables. And then, obviously, you can't threaten a child forever. So once they had developed the habit of eating these particular vegetables, then they waited to see how long would they sustain the habit. Because that's the key. That is the key. A bribe is not a sustainable project. An incentive could be. A bribe is basically saying, let's get you over this threshold right now. I'm not building a habit. I'm not building character. I'm just dealing with the current situation, which goes back again to your point about being impulsive. The bribe is just, we have a situation, we're going to deal with the situation. So eat your Brussels sprouts and then you can have ice cream. That kind of thing. That's a bribe. So here, the first program was, kind of just like, you have no choice. You've got to eat it. And the sustainability was zero. In other words, as soon as the pressure was off, these kids did not sustain eating those vegetables. But what they did find was when they offered an incentive, and they experimented with two kinds of incentives. This is where it gets really interesting. They experimented with a tangible incentive. So in other words, if you eat your vegetables, you will get whatever it is that they were going to offer them, whether it was immediate or after. Let's say you eat your vegetables for a week, then you get an incentive, which is more likely a sustainable approach. So what happened was the kids started to eat the vegetables, and then after they reduced the incentive and eventually removed the incentive, they sustained the habit. In other words, the incentive helped them to develop a healthy habit. What's fascinating about it is, in the third version of the experiment, the incentive was purely verbal. In other words, they didn't give them anything. But every time the child ate the vegetables, they gave them this very strong verbal reassurance or acknowledgement or appreciation or compliment, whatever the case was. You're amazing. I know that's hard for you, but you appreciate it's healthy, whatever it was that they said. And they discovered that in that scenario, the sustainability of the habit was as much as if they gave them a tangible incentive.
Not more.
As much. You would have thought it might have been a little bit less, right? I'm saying many people would think that's why we're constantly incentivizing with things, because we assume that the incentive of a thing is going to be more compelling. But actually, this research illustrates that just giving them verbal recognition is incentive enough to create a sustainable habit, which is fascinating, right? Fascinating. So now, comparing the two studies, what social science says is that you have to be able to tell the difference between something a child has already done of their own accord. That was the first experiment. Those are the kids who were already drawing, versus something that the child has not yet learned to do, like the case of the healthy vegetable that they don't want to eat. So if it's something they've already done in the past, then the incentive actually works against you. So if you had a child who, through a period of time, let's say, was really good at brushing their teeth, and now they're going through a patch where they're not brushing their teeth, if you introduce an incentive at that point in time, there's a good chance you're actually going to undermine the habit they used to have. Because now what you've said is, instead of recognizing that this habit is part of who you are, you're actually saying this habit requires some kind of external input in order to sustain it, and that weakens the habit. On the other hand, and this is what's so fascinating about human psychology, on the other hand, if there was never the skill, so like for example, they never ate the vegetable, and now you introduce some kind of an incentive, that could help them develop the interest or the habit in that particular behavior, and that's actually good for them. Obviously, you don't keep the incentive going forever, or you modify the incentive as it goes, and it's got to be age appropriate. You don't want a teenager with a star chart. So you've got to find a way, to kind of mitigate over the course of time. But the goal is that you eventually shift them away from the incentive, but the incentive is a helpful means of getting them to develop this habit, which is really, really interesting. What's interesting about that also is that fits perfectly with a model that the Rambam teaches for education. Very interesting. Because the Rambam says that when you're dealing with a child, he says you cannot expect that a child is going to do the right things just because they're the right things. A child has to have something which relates to them. So they have to have some kind of an incentive. And so he speaks about the fact, obviously in those days they didn't have the range of possibilities that we have today. And we can tell your child you're going to get all these different kinds of edible treats, or you're going to get all these different kinds of toys. In those days, what did they have to offer the children? So he speaks about the fact that they used to give them either nuts, or they used to give them like these little honey balls. I don't know exactly what it was made of. That's what they used to offer them. So those were the incentives. Back if you were in a classroom in the Dark Ages, that's what they used to offer. So he says, when a child is a child, that's what you offer them. And then as they grow older and they start to mature, you start to shift them away from the incentive and start to teach them the value of what it is that they're doing. So it's quite similar to what we're learning of here. If you want to develop a new skill that the child does not already have, then there is scope for introducing some kind of an incentive. And your view has to be that you don't live off incentives. And you have to kind of hold your child's hand and guide them through it to the point where they actually come to appreciate the value of what they're doing. Okay, which I think makes a lot of sense. You don't want a child who is, as an adult, still waiting to be acknowledged because they're doing the right thing. You don't want them to wait to be rewarded because they're doing the right thing. And by the way, if you do that to a society, and I think the West has done this to a large extent to society, you'll end up with a highly immature population who's not willing to do anything unless they're getting a benefit for it, which is crippling for a society. You need people to learn, in the Rambam's model, the ultimate state, he says, is oise es ha'emes, you do the right thing, or direct translation, you do what is true, mipnei shehu emes, because it is true. Not because of the benefit that you're going to get. But then he adds in a little perspective, which is, but don't worry, v'soif ha'tova lavoi biglala. But don't worry, if you do the right thing, you will always get benefit for it. It's always going to land up being better for you if you're doing the right thing. But your motivation should not be to get something out of it, should not be to receive that incentive or that bribe or that reward, whatever you want to call it. It should be because this is valuable. So as an educational process, the process starts with the incentives, and then you outgrow it, and you get to a point where it starts to resonate, that this is actually something I believe in, this is something I care about, and that's why I'm doing it, even though to get me started, I needed some kind of an incentive. If you think about that, it's not altogether different with the rest of us, even as adults. If you think about it, people who offer us things, let's say, for example, lifestyle choices, health choices, personal safety, whatever they are, usually the marketing is not about the intrinsic value of the product. Usually the marketing is about something that we will benefit from. So if you had to, for example, look at Discovery Vitality as an example, the goal is to get you to the point that you actually care about your own health. And so therefore you eat better and you watch your exercise and you make sure to take care of your mental health, etc. So that all around you'll live a longer, better life. But the way that they hook you is, if you get your 10,000 steps, you're going to get your free coffee, right? So it's a completely incentivized program. But ultimately, the hope is that you don't live on Vitality to get your free coffees or your discount at the gym, even if people get the discount and never use the gym. But ultimately, the goal is that they want you to actually start to develop these habits so that they become your own. And that's really where we want to be, that it should become our own. Okay? So that's kind of the principle. That's the universal principle of incentives. That bribes are never healthy because bribes are reactionary, bribes are impulsive, bribes are short-term. That's never a great way to handle a child. How you should handle the tantrum, we'll have to leave for another conversation, right? But the bribe is not the solution to the tantrum. The bribe is not the solution to get the kid out of the car. The bribe is not the solution to get the child to brush their teeth. That's not the solution. An incentive program that is developed and requires long-term habit building, 100%, and then you have to outgrow the incentives because you also have to learn that these things are intrinsically valuable. Let's see if we can find something related to that or some kind of a model for that in Judaism. I've mentioned to you that you've got the Rambam's program for education, which is quite insightful, but I'm going to come from another angle altogether. It's a bit funny to talk about this angle at this time of the year because it's not the time of the year when this happens, but it happens to be in the Torah portion, so that's kind of where we're getting the reference point. And that is Yom Tov. Okay, so we've just had Yom Tov. We don't have another Yom Tov for a couple of months. But we're going to use Yom Tov just as a little bit of a test of this concept of incentives versus intrinsic value. So when it comes to Yom Tov, generically, besides the fact that every Yom Tov has its own particular thing, but generically, what is the feeling that you're supposed to associate with Yom Tov? You, your children, your family. What's the feeling that you're supposed to associate with Yom Tov? And just to guide this conversation a little bit more clearly, what's the difference between the feeling that you're supposed to associate with Yom Tov versus the feeling that you're supposed to associate with Shabbos? Because they're very similar in many respects, right? And the behavior that we have on Shabbos and on Yom Tov is very similar. So let's try and make a distinction over here between the overall emotion or state of mind that's associated with Shabbos versus the overall emotion or state of mind that's associated with Yom Tov. So let's start, Shabbos. If you had to summarize in one word, what is the feeling that you should have on Shabbos? What would that word be? Connection. Okay. Relaxing. Rest. It's the day of rest. So the primary overriding feature of Shabbos should be a sense of exhale. Just breathe. What's the primary overriding feeling that should be associated with Yom Tov? Not so simple, right? Especially when you consider we don't do it every single week, so we don't necessarily have the same awareness as we do for Shabbos, because Shabbos is always there. But what's the headspace? What's the overarching feeling that you're supposed to have on Yom Tov? Okay, so I can see you're already thinking like Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, right? Which is very much about awareness and introspection and connection and all that kind of stuff. Absolutely. Fine. So let's talk about what are called the three major Yom Tovs of the year, which is Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. What would you say is the common theme or the one word that's supposed to capture the attitude or the experience that we should have over those holidays? And remember, I'm looking for an emotion over here more than anything else. A feeling. What?
Like freedom.
Freedom is very Pesach, yes?
Connection.
Very specific. Connection, again, we said connection could be Shabbos as well. So that's not unique. What's the feeling that we're supposed to have? It's interesting, right? It's interesting. Okay, let's come at this from a different angle. When your child comes home before Shabbos, obviously they know that Shabbos is special. They're looking forward to Shabbos. They know that there's certain things that will happen on Shabbos that don't happen during the rest of the week. Fine. So they have a positive attitude towards Shabbos. When Yom Tov is coming, how does your child come home? Excited. Exactly. So what's the feeling that's supposed to be associated with Yom Tov? Excitement, joy. That's why we talk about v'samachta b'chagecha, that you're supposed to rejoice on the Yom Tovs. So the primary feeling that's supposed to be associated with Shabbos is relax, rest. The primary feeling that is supposed to be associated with Yom Tov is joy. Now I'm going to ask you a personal question. Is it automatic? So the minute you light the candles on Yom Tov, now I feel joy. Is that how it works? I can understand when it comes to Shabbos that you could light the candles and literally feel a sense of relaxation. That works, right? That actually happens. Because if you're keeping Shabbos, you turned off your phone, you know that you have no appointments tomorrow. It's just like a different headspace. So that kind of happens automatically. But Yom Tov, when you're supposed to switch into joy, does it just happen? You just light your candles and bada, everybody's in a state of joy? No, never. If you're fortunate, the kids, yes, the kids are very excited because children love, and especially if the school does it well, they build this excitement and they know the theme of the Yom Tov that's coming and the events that we're going to do. So a kid is happy and excited to stay up late and be at the Pesach Seder and ask the questions and find the Afikomen. And they're excited to go sit outside and eat in the sukkah. You know, it talks to them, and they're excited about the cheesecake that they're going to get on Shavuos or whatever. Because even Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which we come to with trepidation, the kids arrive over there with excitement. Oh, it's so exciting! It's Rosh Hashanah. The apples in honey. It's probably one of their favorite tactile experiences that they have as kids. Doesn't just happen just like that. So we actually need something to get us into a state of joy. It's not our natural habitat. For some people, yes. Some people just live constantly in a state of joy. And we always, we want to know what's wrong with them or what they're on. But for the rest of us, it doesn't just happen like that, right? Joy doesn't just happen like that. So we need something. We need a catalyst for joy. The question is, what's that catalyst? So what would you say? What's that? The meal.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you're the one making the meal, is it a source of joy?
Only when you're eating.
Only when you get to the point that you're sitting and eating, right? Okay, fine. So good. So food equals joy. We're a Jewish crowd.
Yeah.
That's how it works, right? For us, food equals joy. Okay, good. What else? Think about this on a personal note. What would make you happy on Yom Tov, or run up to Yom Tov? What would get you into a good headspace? What would lift your spirits? What would make you happy coming into Yom Tov?
Some of the songs, the different songs.
Okay, songs, definitely. And there's something about music and singing that puts us into a particular headspace. If you're singing upbeat songs, then you're going to feel happier. That's for sure. What else? Make this quite personal. What would make you feel happy coming into Yom Tov?
It's just knowing that the kids are excited and that you have the day.
Okay, so as a classic mother response, if my kids are happy and if I could spend time with my kids in a happy environment, then I'm going to be happy. True. Okay, is that it? Is that all it takes? Because then you're easy to please, easy to make happy. So I'll tell you what the Rambam says. The Rambam says it depends who you're dealing with. Not everybody is stimulated to joy in the same way. So the Rambam speaks about 3 categories of people: men, women, children. And he says there's a way to make men experience joy, there's a way to make women experience joy, there's a way to make children experience joy. So if you're telling me that there's a method I could use, and that method is X for children, what do you think the method would be for children? So, of course, they're already excited because of school and they've helped to create that sense in it. But what could I do as a parent for my child that would help them to be joyous on Yom Tov?
Bring them into the preparation and the home.
Bring them into preparation. True. That's true. What else?
To get them excited about Yom Tov.
To get them excited about Yom Tov. Give them treats. If a child knows that when Yom Tov comes, they're going to get treats, they're going to be excited about Yom Tov. That's just how it is. Whether Chanukah Geld, exactly.
Yeah.
Prize for the Afikomen.
Yes.
Right? It's exactly that kind of thing. So if they know that they're going to get something which is a treat, whether it is an edible treat or whether it is a toy or whatever the case is, but if they know they're getting a treat, they're going to be excited about Yom Tov. That's how children are. So what we're seeing over here is you can give a child something. Besides the fact that you can involve them, teach them, have them learn the songs, etc. But you can give a child something that's going to add to their simcha. Okay, good. With that information, so what do you give women to help them have more simcha? You'll like the Rambam's advice. I can tell you that much.
Right, so you're still giving us treats.
Yeah, more specifically. So the Rambam says that for Yom Tov, a man has to buy his wife new clothing and jewelry.
Okay.
Is that going to get you simcha? Right? A new outfit's going to give you simcha. A piece of jewelry is going to give you simcha. Well, I'm not saying you can't have treats, but, So there you have it. That the Rambam is basically saying we have to get into the headspace of each member of the family and work out what they need in order to have simcha.
I haven't seen this in your notes.
You haven't
I
seen...
haven't seen this in your newsletter to the...
Yeah, exactly. And you definitely haven't seen it in practice from the husbands. Now the question is, what do the men need in order to have simcha?
They're probably more physical beings.
That's right. So what do they need?
Some kind of outlet.
No, not to say. Okay, fine. Even an outlet, you could say. So the Rambam says for the men,
The control of the...
meat and wine.
Okay.
Think about it.
There's
Right?
no joy without meat.
There's no joy without meat, without wine. Exactly. That's what it says. So there you've got these three different categories of joy. Is it absolutely prescriptive? What happens if it's a woman who couldn't care for jewelry? Fine. Okay, so you modify. But the point is that you've got to have, in the Rambam's view, you've got to have something which is quite physical in order to get to have the joy of Yom Tov. Now, is Yom Tov a physical or a spiritual time?
Should be a little bit of both, but probably...
Correct.
less.
But it should be spiritual. Even if there is some kind of a physical experience, it should be spiritual as well. Sounds like what the Rambam is telling us is that you need an incentive to get somebody, even an adult, into a higher state. Because if Yom Tov is supposed to be a spiritual time, in order to get us into the joy of a spiritual time, don't just tell us to go sit and daven. I mean, maybe there are some people at that level, that's what's going to give them simcha. But for the most of us, we need a nice piece of meat, a nice glass of wine, a nice piece of jewelry, a nice treat. That's what we're going to need in order to stimulate simcha. But the Rambam says something incredibly interesting. He says that is our reality nowadays. It didn't always used to be this way. He says once upon a time there was a temple in Jerusalem, and then for Yom Tov what you would do is you would bring a sacrifice. It was called the Shalmei Simcha. So shlamim is a particular class of sacrifices where part of the meat is burnt on the altar, part is given to the Kohanim to eat, part is eaten by the individual who brought the sacrifice. So you got to eat some of that meat, right? But the Rambam says that in the days of the temple, the simcha that you got, the joy that you got was because you could bring a sacrifice. Not because you could eat, because you could bring a sacrifice. In other words, in his view, no incentives. You got to go straight to the highest version of spiritual experience where the Yom Tov should be a time of joy. Why? Because it's a Yom Tov. Because you have a relationship with Hashem, like you said before, connection. That should be the cause of your simcha. Nowadays, in the absence of the temple, we have no choice. We don't have that level of connection. So we've got to kind of bring in other things into play, which is have a good meal, have nice clothes, have treats for the kids. That's what's going to get you to have simcha. In other words, much aligned with what we learned earlier, that the Rambam has a schedule for education, which is start with incentives, and then eventually you'll get the kids to mature enough that they won't have to rely on those incentives. Sounds like he's saying a similar thing about us. We are not at that spiritual level that they used to have in the temple. So therefore, we're also like children in a sense in terms of our spirituality. So we actually need incentives. That's what it sounds like he is saying. But I'm going to come from a slightly different angle because I think that the different angle, this is an observation that the Rebbe makes about what the Rambam has to say. This angle, I think, really speaks to the core of our conversation. Should you, I'm deleting the word bribe, incentivize your child? And bear in mind the two experiments that we spoke about right at the beginning because it's going to be relevant to this conversation. See, the Rebbe makes a different observation. He says at the end of the day, we are dual beings. One side of us is very powerful and spiritual. In the language of Chabad Hasidus, we call that the godly soul. The other part of us is very base and materialistic, and in Hasidus we call that the animal soul. And at any given time, one of those two sides of us is dominant. It's like a power struggle at any given time. That's why we know ourselves. Sometimes we feel so inspired. Sometimes we feel so low. And low could mean uninspired, but it could also mean just caring about materialistic things without any altruism, without any aspiration for something higher than ourselves. That's how we are. So now, if there's a power struggle, you might have experienced this power struggle at certain times. Because if there's a power struggle between the part of me that is divine, that just wants to rise and connect to Hashem, and the part of me that's an animal that just wants to have a good time, eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow we die, if they're in a power struggle, when do you think that struggle is going to be the harshest? At your high points, actually. Because the minute your neshama starts pulling, that's when your animal is going to feel the most threatened, and it's going to start pulling in the other direction. That's why, for example, when you try to daven, that's usually when you have the weirdest distracting thoughts. You know, when you're just scrolling through the Instagram, you don't have these dark thoughts that you just, whatever the content is, that's the basic, you know. When you're driving your car, you might be thinking about arbitrary things, you know, your shopping list or what your kid's supposed to do after school or what you should make for supper. When you daven, that's when you start to have the darkest thoughts, most inappropriate thoughts. Whatever inappropriate means, anything that is going to get in the way of your spiritual progress. Because whenever the soul is rising, the animal needs to kind of try pull back because it's afraid. What happens if you get too caught up with your soul, and then we're not going to be able to enjoy life anymore? So imagine the scene. Don't take this the wrong way. Imagine the scene, you're trying to eat supper, and you've got your dog that's right there next to you. That's, you know, you're trying to eat, and the dog is trying to get in your lap. So what do? You take some of the food and you give the dog some food so it won't disturb you, so you could eat. In exactly the same way, the Rambam is effectively saying, when it comes to Yom Tov, which is supposed to be such a spiritual time, you've got to settle your animal. So you've got to essentially throw it a bone. If it's a child, the child just needs a little bit of treats. And then the animal within the child is settled, and we can start to talk to the neshama within the child. If it's a woman, give the woman clothing or jewelry. The animal is now satisfied. Now we can speak to the woman's soul on Yom Tov. If it's a man, give him a piece of meat and a glass of wine. The animal is satisfied. Now we can speak to the soul. In other words, the Rambam's view is that fundamentally we are people who always need incentives, because fundamentally we always have a major distraction going on that's trying to pull us away from what we know is the right thing. And that's as adults, so it certainly must be the case as kids. In other words, in the Rambam's program, you have to acknowledge your child's limitations. Yes, we have the highest ideals and we wish for our children to really resonate with everything that's right, but we have to be realistic. And in a realistic world, people, children included, need incentives, not bribes. Bribes are unhealthy, but incentives. They need a program which says, do this and that over this period of time, and you will get something that you, in your most base animal state, could appreciate, because that's the way I'm going to get you, in your most divine, developed state, to grow. That's the Rambam's view. So is he in favor of incentives? Absolutely. Why? Because we're a dual system human, and we've got to satisfy both sides of the system in order to grow. So does a child need an incentive? Child needs an incentive. Do we have to remember that experiment right at the beginning that said, just make sure that you don't use the incentive to replace something that they're already doing? That's really important as well, which brings us to the next point. There is another version of how the laws of Yom Tov are supposed to go. It's written by the Alter Rebbe, that's the first Rebbe of Chabad, who wrote what's called the Shulchan Aruch Harav, which is a code of Jewish law. And in his code of Jewish law, he says almost the exact same thing that the Rambam says, with one little difference. He speaks about the men and the women and the children. He speaks about the same kind of offering for Yom Tov for each of them. But the one little difference he says is, in the days of the temple, the joy that we got, even then, was not from bringing the sacrifice, it was from eating the meat of the sacrifice. In other words, the Rambam was saying back in the old days, the highest level is where a person escapes their material needs and they just do what's right because it's right. And the Alter Rebbe says, at the highest level, you still have to actually enjoy the meat yourself. In other words, An incentive is not, from his perspective, an incentive is not to say it's unfortunate that you've got this part of yourself that's so immature. So we've got to be pragmatic and deal with that part of you that is so immature by offering it something that is attractive to it. The Alter Rebbe says that's not how we should look at it. The way we should look at it is we should say, we want that part of ourselves or of our child that is so immature to be part of the process. We don't want to just shush it by saying, here you go, have your treats, now we can have Yom Tov. We want it to feel the sensitivity of a Yom Tov. So in his view, when you give the man meat to eat, you're inviting his animal side into a spiritual experience. When you give a woman a piece of jewelry, you're inviting her animal side into a spiritual experience. When you're giving your child a treat, you're inviting his animal side into the experience. So in other words, he's saying when you incentivize your child, obviously it's got to be a mature incentive, not a bribe, which is an immature incentive. When you're inviting your child to a mature incentive program, what you're saying is, do this over a period of time. Develop a healthy habit, and you will benefit from it as well. It's because I'm trying to train you that there is benefit from doing the right thing. I'm trying to train the part of you that is so self-centered, that is always going to be an animal. Even one day when you're a mature adult, it's still going to be an animal. I want to train that part of you to also start to appreciate the value of good things. So why am I incentivizing you? Not because I don't trust you, not because I don't think you have the maturity or the wisdom to understand what I'm teaching when I teach it. It's because I'm acknowledging that we are complex people, and complex people will always have a part of themselves that is always just chasing the what's in it for me. And I want that part of you to mature as well, not just your brain. Right? Because often that's what we say, your brain's going to mature. How could you behave this way? Sometimes we're disappointed with the child. You normally behave so. How come you're so reckless at this point? I want to bring the reckless side of you along for the journey. So practically what that really means is this. We should never bribe a child because that's a reactionary position. When we do incentivize a child, it needs to be mature incentives. Mature incentives mean I have a very clear program that I'm trying to achieve. I have a very clear objective within that program which says, I want you to build a habit that is a healthy habit. And I trust that when we build this healthy habit, all of you, meaning even the part of you that is animal in nature, will also be able to come on board. And that's why I'm offering you an incentive. Not because that's a sign of your weakness, so you need my support. That's a sign of your reality, which needs to kind of align between where your neshama wants to be and where your impulses tend to take you. So let's get your impulses in line with your neshama. That's why I'm incentivizing you. Now, you're not going to have this whole speech every time you give a child an incentive, but that's what should be running through our minds, because that will guide us on how to make an incentive, what kind of incentives to use, and what kind of program to match to an incentive. That it's not just, you do it today, you get your prize tomorrow. It's building character. It's building resilience. It's building commitment. It's establishing healthy habits. That should be the kind of thing that informs what my incentive program is going to be for my kids. Which, of course, is very easy to do. But